I'm going to give a quick introduction. We just have a couple favors to ask all of you to remain respectful, regardless of your personal beliefs or political views, that this remain a place that our speaker can speak what he wants to, okay? So be nice. Okay, I'm just gonna give a quick introduction, and without further ado, we'll bring Ron Paul out. Congressman Ron Paul of Texas enjoys a national reputation as a premier advocate for liberty in politics today. Okay, I promise, if you let me get through this, you can cheer as loud as you want, I promise. Okay? Okay, so Dr. Paul is the leading spokesman in Washington for limited constitutional government, low taxes, free markets, and a return to sound monetary policies based on commodity-banked currency. For years, Dr. Paul has been known among both his colleagues in Congress and his constituents for his consistent voting record in the House of Representatives. Dr. Paul never votes for legislation unless the proposed measure is expressly authorized by the Constitution. In the words of former Treasury Secretary William Simon, Dr. Paul has been the one exception to the gang of 535 on Capitol Hill. Dr. Paul is retiring from Congress after his current term ends in January, but he will continue to work for limited constitutional government through Campaign for Liberty and other organizations he has founded, including the Foundation for Rational Economics and Education and Liberty, PAC. Without further ado, please welcome Ron Paul.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Looks like the revolution is alive and well in Utah. Thank you. We may be just getting started, so I'm delighted to see so many of you here today. That's wonderful. Now, this is an important year for us. There's an election coming up. I don't know, did anybody notice there was something going on in Tampa a few weeks ago? Yeah. So, but there is a lot of excitement right now because we are dealing with a lot of important issues, and they're especially important for young people to thinking about them because some of these things are falling on your shoulders, and this is the reason I like so often to come to the universities, and did this a few times, in the last couple years, as a matter of fact, in the last 4 years. So I am so pleased that when I get a chance that the response is so favorable, because I don't come promising and saying that all we need to do is go to the government to solve the problem. What I would like to do is deliver back to you your God-given right to your lives. The whole question is who is responsible, for the economy, for your personal behavior, and how the world is run. And quite frankly, I don't think the government is responsible for your personal behavior, nor for the economy. It's your responsibility. There's been a lot of talk lately about the fiscal cliff. The fiscal cliff is that event coming up at the beginning of the year. They're terrified that there might be some cuts from the sequestering of funds. But the whole thing is that there aren't any cuts in sequestered funds. There's only cuts on proposed increases. So there aren't any actual cuts, but both sides are hysterical that maybe that the increases won't be as big as they were planned to be. But also the taxes will go up significantly if they don't do something in Washington before the end of the year. And my prediction is they will. They'll wait to the last minute and they'll delay it, they'll postpone it. But it would be such a disaster to see the taxes dramatically increased on the first part of the year. But my suggestion is rather simple. It's not complicated at all. those so-called minor cuts. Let the cuts come. Don't put the money back in and stop, don't raise any taxes. What we need are a lot less taxes and a lot less spending would solve most of our problems. One of the problems that America faces up to, and especially the next generation, and that is Washington right now is in total denial. They're in denial of the seriousness of the problem. And the problem is that we're bankrupt. This country's bankrupt. I mean, $16 trillion in debt and obligation, but that's minor. It's $222 trillion of obligations, for future payouts for the entitlement system. And there's not enough of you there. There are not enough jobs. You can't work hard enough. So Washington is in denial. If they thought it was half as bad as I think it is, they'd cut some spending. And that's what they would have to do. But how do you cut spending if you endorse a system that nobody wants to give up on? Are they going to give up on the welfare state? Oh, no, you can't do that. They consider that immoral. I happen to think the welfare system is immoral because it doesn't work. The last thing, the welfare system, is voluntarism. Has nothing to do with voluntarism. I believe in voluntarism. I believe in charity. I believe in helping people, but I don't believe the government is capable of doing that without hurting people, so therefore I reject that whole notion. The welfare system works on the notion that the government has this moral responsibility to take from one group to give it to another group. And the argument is always for humanitarian reasons. There are poor people, there are people falling through the cracks and need some help. And it's a pretty powerful argument because too often conservatives and libertarians have a hard time answering that. What do? You don't care about people if you don't steal from this group and give it to the people who need or want something or people who won't work. Well, you have to be able to answer that or we won't be able to solve this problem. Because not only is it immoral to steal from one group, if poor people or people who are down on their luck need something and you have something, you don't endorse the idea that they can march in your house and take something. Why should he be able to send a congressman there to march into the house with the IRS and take it and transfer it over there? That's not right. Now, another argument that would make it tough, let's say the welfare system worked, that prosperity persisted forever, we were all doing well, and there were no poor. And you say, well, that's pretty hard. You might argue this theoretical thing about using force and transferring money to help the poor. The whole thing is, you end up with more poor. Just think of all the spending that we have, and then the economy turns down because of their shortcomings in understanding of economics. Now we have 46 million people on bread lines. Now they call it food stamps, but those are bread lines. And it's just totally out of control. So it doesn't help the poor people. Once you endorse the principle of welfarism, guess what? The poor get poorer and the rich get richer. So if you understand free market economics, understand the business cycle, we do know that there's downturns, there are bubbles, and we've gone through this, and we're in the middle of this right now. So the whole system was set up to make sure the poor wouldn't fall through the cracks. So the crisis come, which is predictable because of the deficits run up to try to satisfy all the special interests. So we get into the crisis, so the Congress and the Federal Reserve come rushing to the rescue. And guess who receives the benefit? The big banks and the big corporations and foreign governments and foreign central banks, they get the bailouts, and what happens to the poor people that we're supposed to help in the middle class? Middle class individuals lose their jobs and they lose their houses, so it's a totally failed system, and we can't be intimidated by those who argue that if you don't support the welfare transfer system, you're not a humanitarian. If you're a true humanitarian, what you want to defend is liberty and responsibility and a limited government and balanced budgets and honest money. There is something special happening today, and we're in the time of recognizing the end of a particular era. Probably a 100-year era where we have accepted the idea that government should expand, our government should be the policeman of the world, we should have an income tax, and we should have a Federal Reserve to print money when we need money. But guess what? It hasn't worked, and what this crisis is talking about right now is that it's a failure. It's a failure of the Keynesian theory of economic policy, and therefore we have the opportunity to replace Keynesian intervention, big government involved in the economy, and replace it with free markets, sound money, and a gold standard. That's what will solve the problem. In 1913, of course, dramatic changes. Woodrow Wilson changed our foreign policy. He had a wonderful, idealistic thought that we, the people of the United States, have this moral responsibility to make the world safe for democracy. Just think of what's happened since 1913. I mean, we've been in a lot of wars, and they're pretty persistent. But he also knew, and the progressive era knew that, well, you can't do that. You can't usher in the welfare state and the warfare state without a lot of money. So they had to have the income tax, and of course that has grown. At the same time, you had to have the backup, which is the Federal Reserve and the printing of money, which means that a major two-step policy that we could have if you really want your freedoms back in limited government, you get rid of the Federal Reserve and you get rid of the income tax. Now, a lot of people will say, well, that's crazy talk. How could you live without the income tax? How are we going to pay for the government? Well, why don't you become your own government, govern your own lives, and let you keep your money and spend it the way you want to spend it? But that's a good goal, is getting rid of the tax system. But tell you what, taxes and the IRS and all the abuse, that's a symptom. It's a symptom of a changed attitude of the American people and what the role of government ought to be. The founders had a precise role of what they thought the government should be, and it was very limited. Read Article 1, Section 8. Very little authority for the Congress and the federal government to do the things that they've been doing. So what they have done, though, is they've changed their attitude. They've changed attitude about our responsibilities around the world. I believe very strongly in a strong national defense, but I don't believe in preemptive war. I don't believe in starting wars against countries that haven't done anything to us. So in order to have a different monetary system, a different tax system, we as a people have to decide whether or not we should be doing it. Now, one thing is, even when I go to crowds that are less sympathetic than this crowd, I'll say, even if you disagree with me about changing our foreign policy, I said, we'll win this argument because we're going broke. This is how the Soviet system collapsed. Guess what? The Soviets were so foolish, they got bogged down in Afghanistan. So I would say, let's get home from Afghanistan and bring our troops home. So if we change our attitude about the foreign policy, we can have a strong national defense, change our attitude about a welfare system that has failed, change our attitude about free market economics and a sound monetary system and honest money, get rid of the business cycle under those conditions. We wouldn't need all this collection agencies up in Washington, all this invasion of our privacy and into our lives. But if that would happen, believe me, this country would change. Right now, we're still a pretty fortunate country. We're pretty wealthy still, but the wealth is dependent on debt and continuous inflation and trust in a currency that doesn't deserve the trust. And we now are seeing a dramatic change. And after this 100 years, there's been a big change, and now we're facing this bankruptcy. We're facing a crisis time which can change dramatically in a short period of time now because the foundations of our liberties have eroded. The foundation of our monetary system has eroded. The foundation of our economic system. The foundation of a sound foreign policy have eroded. So things could get it out of control rather quickly. Matter of fact, I consider the most dangerous spot in the world right now is probably over in the Middle East with Syria. I mean, all these things going on over there, and we're continually involved. Just think of how much money we, the American people, spent on propping up the Egyptians and having this artificial peace with Israel. Oh, this was for the benefit of Israel and the benefit of us, who knows what. But it was like $45 billion we gave to Egypt, and then it ended badly. The people turned against the government that we prop up. We prop up dictators around the world. So there's a revolution going on over there, so we support the revolutionaries, and they happen to be a bunch of bad guys, and they have Al-Qaeda now in those countries. Libya's the same thing. Libya's a mess now. And we, through NATO, not through Congress, you know, that would be one thing that we could do to slow this up. Don't let our government go to war without a declaration of war by the American people. We've been told, our presidents have told us that they can get the authority from NATO, United Nations. They don't have to come to the Congress. But it's up to us to change that. Government is a reflection of the people. If we want a welfare war for a state and it happens, it's our fault. If they're doing things that you don't like, it's up to us to do something about it. And the individuals who participate in that, I don't believe in preemptive war. I believe that you only declare the war and you do it in defense of this country and not to go in and change other governments around the world. Not only are these wars very costly financially, think of the cost in life and limb. Not only since in the past 10 years, over 8,000 Americans have died, counting the contractors and all. And 45,000 come back severely injured or sick and requiring care. We have an epidemic of veterans coming back committing suicide. So this is a big cost, but the cost financially has been, it added $4 trillion of debt to us in these past 10 years. And it hasn't worked. The foreign policy doesn't work any better than the welfare system works. So here we go in. Yes, we went into Iraq. Still, a bunch of Americans believe we went into Iraq because Iraq had something to do with 9/11. Absolutely false. It had nothing to do with 9/11. But guess what? The American people were told that Al-Qaeda was there, we had to go get them. Al-Qaeda wasn't there. Weapons of mass destruction, nothing there. But then some people said, well, the real reason is the oil. The real reason is we have to really build up so that we can go after the Iranians and overthrow their government as well. But now the government that's in charge of Iraq is a closer ally of Iran than they are with us. It didn't work. It backfired. The Kurds are very independent now, and there's still a lot of chaos and a lot of killing going on over there. So there's no evidence whatsoever that the foreign policy has helped us. It makes us less secure, and we're at a bigger threat, and it, of course, challenges us financially. So what we need, of course, is a reassessment. And a good place to start, whether it's monetary policy or whether it's the welfare system or property rights or civil liberties or the foreign policy, a good place to start, maybe even stop there to improve things, is why don't we make sure that everybody in Washington actually reads the Constitution and obeys the Constitution? A lot of people think that the problem up in Washington is that we don't have anybody that'll compromise and work together. And I was on a TV program the other night, and they asked me that question. I think that's the wrong word. I think for too long we've had too much compromise in Washington. They compromise on all their principles. Whether it's left or right, they get together because both sides. I mean, have you ever noticed that when we change administrations and one promises to cut, do we get to cuts? Do we get balanced budget? Does the government shrink? No, there's always this compromise. Well, we'll raise this for you if you raise this for us. Raise this welfare over here, raise this for corporate welfare over here. So it continues. I think the answer is more in building coalitions, because the freedom philosophy appeals to a lot of people. It isn't like it's a narrow group of conservatives within the Republican Party and we have to take over the Republican Party to show that we believe in certain things. No, there's a coalition. When you look at the Constitution, if you look at civil liberties, if you look at foreign policy, and if you look at economic policies, all of a sudden you'll have people who consider themselves liberal. They'll say, you're right about civil liberties. This is one of the things that happens under war. Essentially, civil liberties are attacked. So you can appeal to liberals on civil liberties. You can appeal to liberals who say, yes, we're fighting too many wars, and come together and have agreements. That, I think, is the way. I think freedom brings people together. I think that is the best thing. Of course, the freedom message on foreign policy is that, yes, there are a lot of problems around the world. It's just that we don't impose those on the American citizens and tax the American citizens or send our children over there to be killed trying to solve all those problems. But what we do is we recognize that we can at least work toward a more peaceful arrangement by following what the founders said, and that is, try diplomacy once in a while, try being friends, try trading with people, quit putting sanctions on everybody that we disapprove of. We've had sanctions on Cuba for 50 years and hasn't done any good. I'd say it's time we traded and visited Cuba again. But we certainly see how working across the political spectrum, how freedom for the individual brings us together. And a lot of people think that if you endorse freedom for the individual, that they might do things that you don't approve of. And quite frankly, they might. But is that our business if they're not hurting anybody? It's up to the individual. In a free society, the responsibility for each and every one of us is on us the individual, to make a decision for our personal lives and our economic lives and our family lives, and not give that responsibility to the government, because they'll mess that up too. But understanding civil liberties, most of us understand civil liberties rather well when it comes to religious liberty, because there are a lot of different religions in this country. And we even, tolerate people who don't want to have a religion. And we shouldn't be, we can be personally, critical or want to teach our children a certain way, but we don't tell other people what they have to believe in. We recognize this. Intellectual freedom is pretty good, and that is we allow people to read books, even controversial books. That's getting a little bit more difficult, but we generally have respected intellectual freedom and religious freedom. If we allow people to make their own decisions about their eternity and what they put into their brain, why is it that we have not adapted and accepted that same principle on what people do with their personal habits and what they put into their bodies? There certainly are some bad habits that are going to hurt some people, and they should assume the responsibility. If you want your freedom and you want to abuse your freedoms, you should suffer the consequences. But think of history on how many people over the many centuries have suffered from bad intellectual ideas, authoritarianism and communism and all these things. Millions and millions of people die from this. Think of the abuse under religion. People take religions and distort religions, and they do evil things in the name of religion. But we don't throw that out. But so often we throw out this responsibility of the individual. We've gotten to the point now where our federal government tells us that you're not allowed to drink raw milk if you want to. And of course, as a physician and as a father and grandfather, I think there's way too much abuse of drugs in this country. I think that the biggest problem with the drug abuse in this country are prescription drugs. And when it comes to what they call the illegal drugs, that's a big problem too. But for me, it's the war on the illegal drugs that's a big problem. It's an excuse to violate civil liberties. It's an excuse to spend trillions of dollars since the early 1970s, since the war on drugs really got busy. It's into the trillions of dollars we spent. And once again, can we show success? Are there no drug addicts out there anymore? Is it just a wonderful thing that's happened? No. That responsibility, if we live in a moral and a virtuous society, you don't need the government to tell us it's dangerous to do certain things. And that is the problem that we've had so long. This was one of the things that we were warned about this early on. Benjamin Franklin said that the Constitution and freedom doesn't work unless you have a virtuous society. And John Adams said a similar thing. He says you have to have a moral society and a religious society for the Constitution and for freedom to work. So if we decide that if the people aren't behaving like they should, just giving more power to the politicians to make us moral and virtuous, it doesn't work. It doesn't work any better than making the economy work better or the wealth being redistributed or more peace throughout the world. It just compounds it. So what we have done over the many, many years is shift too much authority. The founders understood this, and they tried to prevent it and said, look, it should be a very limited government. If you want government, it should be local government. And yet, I think right now, unfortunately, what you're getting as a generation is looking at it, and a lot of people could come to the conclusion the Constitution hasn't worked that well. I mean, when you look at the votes, just go look at the votes. Look at the last 100 votes that we've had in the House of Representatives. You'd probably say, what are they voting on this stuff for? And why are they spending all this money? So the Constitution hasn't worked. So that means it's really up to the people. The politicians don't sit back and think, well, one more politician will make the difference. It won't. The people have to change. And the Congress... But right now, there's an opportunity for that. The economic policies have failed and foreign policy has failed. It's not going to work anymore, so we have the chance to offer something different, something better. It's not brand new. They've talked about freedom and limited government for a long time, but it's really pretty new. when you think about how much time has really been spent in a really free society, we probably had the best example in our early history. But most of history is filled with totalitarians, and most of the countries of the world today are still run by totalitarians. So it's been tested so little. What seems like such a shame is when we had a maximum amount of freedom, we had the greatest amount of prosperity ever in the largest middle class. And if we don't do anything, we've given up on this. So the opportunity now is, since this system can't continue, is when the time comes where we really have to change policy, let's hope there's enough of us there to influence intellectually, what is happening in Washington. Intellectual changes have to come before revolutionary changes come to a government. There was an intellectual groundwork for our revolution in the early days, and they set the standards that led to the revolution and the writing of the Constitution. But right now, the most optimistic thing is what's happening in the country. There truly is a revolution going on in this country, and people's attitudes are changing. If you look at the record of mankind, they claim that recorded history is probably, about 5,000 years. And when you think how long the universe has been around and the world's been around, and that's a very short period of time. But it was very primitive. Up until when? Just in recent history. I mean, it's 1,000 years ago, it was still very primitive. Even 200 years ago, wasn't society rather primitive before even the steam engine? And then 100 years ago, just think of what it was like. I recall my dad telling me that the most dramatic thing in his life was seeing the gasoline engine come. He delivered milk. They had a little dairy, and he delivered milk in a horse and buggy. He went to trucks, ended up with a small dairy with 20 trucks. What a dramatic difference. In my lifetime, the thing that fascinated me most was the first time I saw a TV set. And today, though, with the ending of an era, we're going to see a new era. Now, the philosophy is there, the opportunities are there, but you know what's available to us now? Is the spreading of this information like never before, because we live in the information age. We have an internet, and what we're talking about here today is not something that is narrow in the Republican enclave. This is across the world. Believe me, there are groups of people, even in these countries that you think, no, they're terrible, there's always a pocket there starting to understand the difference. So there's reason to be optimistic about what is happening today. Now, in this last 100 years or so, as technology improved, just think of the scientific improvements in the last 100 years. Been fantastic. All the conveniences. And yet, what hasn't progressed in that last 100 years? And that is a peaceful solution to mankind's problems. It seems like we've made no progress. The more there has been scientific advancement, they've used those advancements to learn how to kill more people. There's been 200 or 300 million people killed in the 20th century. So all this technology that gives us some wonderful things. So where has the progress, why has the progress not occurred outside of, some materialistic benefits and outside of knowing how to fight and kill each other? At the same time, we have made essentially no progress in knowing how to avoid war. But I think a new era is here. I think right now we can expect that this message is going to be new and different, because in the past we only had little bits and pieces of it. But today it's more available to all of us. It's out there, and we can communicate. And it's it's changing just rapidly. In the last 4 or 5 years, it's been dramatically changed. And the one great threat to here is, once again, government. If government sees that the internet and communications is a threat, guess what they want to do? They want to crack down on the internet. This is one reason why I have done my very best to always oppose any legislation that would curtail your freedom to use the internet. But we are on this verge of this new era, and it's up to you. It's up to you to participate. Everybody has a personal responsibility. The personal responsibility is to educate oneself. Sure, go to universities, do your best, but it really falls on your own shoulders. Then your family and friends, you have local responsibilities. We have to be responsible for ourselves and to change ourselves. If each and every one of us would change ourselves and each and every one of us believe this, why would governments do the opposite? Franklin and Adams was right. If the country is immoral, the government's going to be immoral. So it is. Politics are very important. But politics are secondary to this, what I'm talking about. The most important thing is for us to assume this responsibility. We have this free will. We have this moral agency concern about how we run our own lives. And we cannot deliver that to the government. We have to seek to try to make ourselves more virtuous and work for excellence. That should be the goal. If we turn that responsibility over to the government, to say, oh, they're going to make us virtuous. You know, that lends itself to a theocracy, you know, that they get involved in social and personal matters. So the only thing counts is how we take care of ourselves. And why I'm excited about what's happening is the interest shown in this individual responsibility rather than collectivism, which saturated the 20th century, that it is the individuals who then, as they improve themselves, that they can work together with other people. I think this is where we have seen so much progress. You know, it's been said during the campaigns that I've had for the last several years that there's a good response for young people. And I think that is wonderful, because I think this makes all the difference in the world. And a lot of people used to say, well, what we need to do is quit this spending because we're going to dump all this debt on the next generation. I don't say that anymore. It's dumped on us right now, each and every one of us. We're paying the bills right now. That's why we're going to be forced to do something about it. Sometimes it's discouraging because people say, well, you're talking about an individual. We need 51% of the people have to be converted. Not necessarily. It's never happened that way. 51% of the people didn't endorse our revolution against the British, but there was a small group of people, probably 6, 7, 8%, who were determined, who were leaders, who were thought leaders, and others came along. So that's the way it's been for a long time. A majority of people go along and they don't worry too much. And I'll bet you've had people a day or two before the election, who are you going to vote for? I got to decide what I'm going to do. They wait, and yet anybody would come to a meeting like this to listen to me. You have to be a little bit different. But it also means that if you're in that 8%, the responsibility is heavier on your shoulders, and you will have a lot more influence. And you say, well, that's too much work for me. I'll tell you what, if you do it because you have a moral responsibility, that's one reason. You do it because it's for your family, but you also